Sarah Mitchell had always dreamed of visiting London. At 62 years old, she finally had the chance to take the trip she'd been planning for decades. Her husband had passed away 2 years earlier, and their children encouraged her to use the savings they'd put aside for their golden years to see the world. Standing outside Buckingham Palace on a crisp October morning, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the grandeur before her. The golden gates, the perfectly manicured gardens, and the iconic red uniformed guards standing motionless at their posts created a scene straight from a fairy tale. She clutched her camera tightly, trying to capture every detail to share with her family back in Ohio. The crowd around her buzzed with excitement as tourists from every corner of the world gathered to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. Sarah found herself pressed against the metal barriers, her heart racing with anticipation. She had read about this tradition online, but experiencing it in person felt magical. As the ceremony began, Sarah watched in amazement as the guards marched with precision that seemed almost inhuman. Their red tunics were immaculate, their black bearskin hats towering above their heads, and their faces remained completely expressionless, despite the chaos of camera flashes and excited chatter surrounding them. One guard in particular caught Sarah's attention. He stood perfectly still at his post, his rifle held firmly at his side. Something about his posture reminded her of her late husband, who had served in the military during his younger years. The guard's dedication to duty, his unwavering focus, and his professional demeanor brought tears to her eyes. After the ceremony concluded and most tourists began to disperse, Sarah lingered near the gates. She couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to stay a little longer. The guard she had been watching remained at his post, and she found herself studying his face more closely. Despite his stoic expression, she noticed something in his eyes that spoke of weariness and perhaps sadness. An elderly British woman standing nearby noticed Sarah's lingering gaze and struck up a conversation. "First time seeing the guards, dear?" she asked with a kind smile. "Yes," Sarah replied, wiping away a tear. "It's beautiful, but also quite moving. My husband was in the military, and seeing that young man's dedication reminds me of him." The woman nodded knowingly. "These lads take their duty very seriously. They stand for hours without moving in all kinds of weather. People often forget there's a real person under that uniform." As Sarah prepared to leave, she took one last look at the guard. In that moment, something unexpected happened. Despite his training to remain motionless and emotionless, the guard's eyes briefly met hers. For just a split second, his professional mask slipped, and she saw something that broke her heart. A young man who looked utterly alone. Without thinking, Sarah's maternal instincts kicked in. She had raised 3 children and had always been the type of person who could sense when someone needed comfort. This young guard, despite his impressive uniform and stoic demeanor, reminded her of her own son when he was struggling with difficulties, but trying to appear strong. The rational part of her mind told her to walk away. She knew the guards weren't supposed to interact with tourists. She had heard stories about people trying to make them laugh or break their concentration, and she didn't want to cause any trouble. But her heart told her something different. The crowd thinned out even more. Sarah made a decision that would change both her life and the guard's life forever. She approached the barrier slowly, her hands trembling slightly. The guard's eyes flickered toward her briefly, then returned to their fixed position ahead. "Excuse me," she said softly, barely above a whisper. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know that someone sees you, not just the uniform, but you as a person." The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he had heard her words. Sarah continued, her voice gentle and motherly. "My son is about your age, and I know how hard it can be to stand strong when the world feels heavy on your shoulders. Whatever you're going through, you're not alone." At this point, other tourists began to notice the interaction. Some pulled out their phones thinking they were about to witness another attempt to make a guard break character. But Sarah wasn't trying to be funny or get a reaction for social media. She was simply being herself, a mother who recognized pain in a young person's eyes. The guard, whose name was James Thompson, had indeed been struggling. At 24 years old, he had joined the Queen's Guard with pride and determination. But recent months had been difficult. His father had been diagnosed with cancer, his girlfriend had broken up with him, and he was dealing with financial pressures that seemed insurmountable. Standing at his post day after day, maintaining his composure while his personal life crumbled, had become increasingly challenging. When Sarah spoke to him with such genuine kindness, something inside him stirred. He had been trained to ignore distractions, to remain focused on his duty regardless of what happened around him. But this woman's words weren't meant to distract or amuse, they were meant to heal. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She had written a brief note during her wait, not knowing if she would have the courage to give it to him. The note simply read, "You matter. Your service matters. Someone in Ohio is praying for you. Stay strong. A friend." She placed the note carefully on the ground near the barrier where he might see it later, then did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She pressed her hand to her heart, and then extended it toward him in a gesture of blessing and support. What happened next would become a moment that touched hearts around the world and reminded everyone that beneath uniforms and titles, we are all human beings in need of connection and compassion. James felt his heart racing beneath his red tunic as Sarah's words washed over him. He had been standing guard for nearly 3 hours, and his legs ached from maintaining perfect posture. But the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the emotional weight he carried every day. This stranger's unexpected kindness hit him like a wave of warmth he hadn't felt in months. As Sarah extended her hand toward him in blessing, James made a split-second decision that went against every rule. In his training manual, his eyes, which were supposed to remain fixed straight ahead, shifted to meet hers directly. In that moment, the professional barrier between them dissolved, and two human souls connected across the divide of duty and circumstance. The tourists, who had been watching with their phones ready expecting entertainment instead, found themselves witnessing something profound. The raw emotion in both Sarah's face and the guard's eyes was unmistakable. Several people lowered their phones, sensing they were intruding on something sacred. James' training screamed at him to look away, to return to his post, to ignore the interaction completely. But something about Sarah's presence felt like a lifeline he desperately needed to grab. His father's illness had been weighing heavily on his mind, and the pressure of maintaining perfect composure while his world crumbled had been nearly unbearable. Sarah saw the recognition in his eyes and knew her instincts had been correct. This young man was struggling with something deep and painful. Her own experience with loss and hardship had taught her to recognize the signs of someone barely holding on. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," she whispered, just loud enough for James to hear. "I know what it feels like to stand strong when everything inside you is breaking, but you don't have to carry it alone." The words hit James like a bolt of lightning. His own father's cancer diagnosis had made him acutely aware of mortality and loss. Hearing this woman speak about her own grief with such grace and strength gave him a perspective he hadn't considered before. Without breaking eye contact, James did something that shocked everyone present, including himself. He gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible but unmistakably intentional. It was his way of acknowledging her kindness and letting her know that her words had reached him. An older gentleman in the crowd whispered to his wife, "Did you see that?" He actually responded to her. But there was no mockery in his voice, only amazement at the genuine human connection they were witnessing. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the impact of their brief exchange. She had come to London as a tourist, seeking distraction from her own grief. But instead, she had found an opportunity to offer comfort to someone else. The experience was transforming her understanding of healing and purpose. A palace security officer began walking toward them. Having noticed the prolonged interaction, Sarah quickly stepped back from the barrier, not wanting to cause trouble for James. But before the officer reached them, she made one final gesture that would be remembered by everyone present. She placed both hands over her heart and mouthed the words "thank you" to James. Not thank you for his service to the crown, but thank you for allowing her to connect with him as a human being. Thank you for receiving her kindness. Thank you for letting her matter to someone again, James watched as the security officer approached Sarah with a concerned expression. He wanted to protect her from any consequences of their interaction, but he was bound by his position and couldn't speak or move from his post. All he could do was watch as the officer questioned her about her behavior. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to move along," the officer said firmly but politely. "The guards are not permitted to interact with visitors." Sarah nodded understandingly. "Of course, officer. I meant no disrespect. I was just moved by the dedication I witnessed here today." She gathered her purse and the small paper she had dropped near the barrier, realizing it wasn't appropriate to leave it. But as she turned to walk away, something remarkable happened. Other tourists who had witnessed the exchange began to approach her. A young mother with her children told Sarah how beautiful the moment had been. An elderly veteran shook her hand and thanked her for recognizing the humanity in the guard service. "What you did back there," said a middle-aged man with a British accent that was proper lovely. "These lads don't get enough recognition for what they endure." Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had been touched by what they witnessed. Complete strangers began sharing their own stories of loss, service, and the importance of human connection. The brief interaction between Sarah and James had created a ripple effect of empathy and understanding among everyone present. Meanwhile, James remained at his post. But everything had changed for him. The weight on his shoulders felt lighter somehow. A stranger's kindness had reminded him that his struggles didn't define him, and that even in his most difficult moments, he could still touch another person's life simply by being present and authentic. The security officer, having dispersed the crowd, returned to James's position. "You all right there, Thompson?" he asked quietly. James couldn't respond verbally while on duty, but his eyes conveyed that he was indeed all right. Better than he had been in months, actually. The officer, who had served as a guard himself years earlier, understood the unique pressures of the position and was relieved to see some life return to James's expression. As Sarah walked through the streets of London that afternoon, she couldn't stop thinking about the young guard. She had planned to visit several tourist attractions, but instead found herself sitting in a nearby cafe, writing in her journal about the extraordinary experience she had just had. She wrote about the power of human connection, about the importance of seeing beyond uniforms and titles to the real people underneath. She wrote about how reaching out to comfort someone else had actually brought her more healing than any therapy session or support group ever had. What Sarah didn't know was that her brief encounter with James was about to create a chain of events that would reach far beyond that morning at Buckingham Palace. The story of their connection was already beginning to spread, shared by the tourists who had witnessed it and touched by the genuine emotion they had observed. 3 hours later, James completed his shift and was finally able to step away from his post. His mind immediately returned to the encounter with the American tourist. As he walked toward the guard quarters, he felt different somehow, as if a weight he'd been carrying for months had lifted slightly. His fellow guardsman Michael Chen noticed the change immediately. "You look better, mate," Michael said as they changed out of their ceremonial uniforms. "Something happened during your shift?" James hesitated, unsure how to explain what had occurred. The guards rarely discussed personal matters, and he wasn't sure if his colleagues would understand the impact of his brief interaction with Sarah. "A tourist said something kind to me today," James finally said. "It just reminded me of some things I'd forgotten." Michael nodded knowingly. "Sometimes that's all it takes, isn't it? One person seeing you as a human being instead of just a decoration." That evening, James found himself thinking about his father for the first time in weeks without feeling overwhelming despair. The cancer diagnosis had seemed like a death sentence, but Sarah's story about losing her husband and still finding the strength to comfort a stranger gave him hope that his family could navigate this challenge too. He decided to call his parents, something he'd been avoiding because he didn't want to burden them with his own stress while they were dealing with his father's illness. "James," his mother's voice was bright with surprise. "We weren't expecting to hear from you tonight. How are you, love?" For the first time in months, James answered honestly. "I'm doing better than I have been, Mum. I met someone today who reminded me of what's really important." He told his parents about Sarah's kindness, carefully omitting the details that might get him in trouble with his superiors. His mother began crying on the other end of the phone. "Oh, James," she said through her tears. "I've been so worried about you. You've seemed so distant lately, and I knew you were struggling with your father's diagnosis." "I was," James admitted, "but today I realized that pushing you away wasn't protecting anyone. I want to be there for you and Dad, not hiding behind my uniform and pretending everything's fine." His father took the phone. Despite the weakness in his voice from the chemotherapy, his words were strong and clear. "Son, I'm proud of the man you've become, and I'm proud that someone saw that goodness in you today. Don't ever forget that your service matters, but your heart matters even more." Meanwhile, across London in her small hotel room, Sarah was video calling her children back in Ohio. Her daughter Emma was the first to notice the change in her mother's demeanor. "Mom, you look different," Emma said, studying her mother's face through the computer screen. "More peaceful somehow." Sarah's son David joined the call from his apartment in Chicago. "How was your first day of sightseeing? Did you see the palace?" "I did more than see it," Sarah replied, and she began to tell them about her encounter with the young guard. As she spoke, she watched her children's expressions change from curiosity to amazement. "Mom," her youngest daughter Lisa chimed in from Seattle, "that sounds incredible. You always did have a gift for knowing when someone needed a kind word. Your father would be so proud," Emma added, wiping tears from her eyes. "He always said your superpower was making people feel seen and valued." The conversation with her children reinforced what Sarah had begun to realize during her afternoon. In the cafe. The encounter at Buckingham Palace hadn't just helped a struggling young guard. It had helped her rediscover her own sense of purpose and connection. Back at the barracks, James was experiencing his own moment of clarity. He sat at his small desk and began writing a letter. Not to Sarah, whose name he didn't even know, but to himself. He wrote about the loneliness he'd been feeling, about his fears regarding his father's illness, and about how a stranger's compassion had reminded him that vulnerability wasn't weakness. The next morning, word of the previous day's interaction had somehow reached the ears of Sergeant Major Williams, the stern but fair leader of James's unit. Williams called James into his office, and James prepared for a reprimand. "Thompson," the sergeant major began, "I heard there was an incident during your shift yesterday involving a tourist." James straightened his shoulders, ready to accept whatever consequences awaited him. "Yes, sir. I briefly made eye contact with a visitor who was speaking to me. I know it was against protocol, sir." Williams studied James for a long moment. "Multiple witnesses described what they saw, Thompson. They said it was one of the most moving displays of human decency they'd ever witnessed." James blinked in surprise. He had expected anger, not praise. "Son," Williams continued, "our job is to serve the Crown and represent the best of British values. Sometimes that means standing perfectly still and following protocol to the letter. But sometimes it means remembering that we're human beings first, and that our humanity is part of what makes our service meaningful." Williams leaned forward in his chair. "I've been watching you struggle these past few months. I know about your father's illness, and I've seen how it's been affecting you. What happened yesterday, allowing yourself to connect with someone who saw your pain and offered comfort, that took courage. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." James felt tears, threatening to fall. "Thank you, sir. It meant more to me than I can express." "The tourist, did anyone get her name?" Williams asked. "I don't believe so, sir. She was just a kind American woman who saw someone who needed encouragement." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes, the most important people in our lives are the ones whose names we never learn, but their impact lasts forever." As James left the sergeant major's office, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not only had he not been punished for his moment of human connection, but he had been reminded that his superiors were human too, capable of understanding and compassion. That afternoon, Sarah was visiting Westminster Abbey when she overheard a conversation between two British women discussing that lovely moment at the palace yesterday between the American tourist and the guard. Sarah smiled to herself, amazed that their brief interaction had already become part of the London tourist experience narrative. What neither Sarah nor James knew was that their story was about to reach an even wider audience, thanks to one particular witness who had been profoundly moved by what she had observed. Margaret Hopkins was a retired journalist who had worked for the BBC for 35 years. At 71, she still had an eye for a compelling human interest story, and what she had witnessed at Buckingham Palace the previous day had stayed with her throughout the night. Margaret had been visiting her granddaughter when she decided to take a walk past the palace, as she had done countless times throughout her life as a London resident. She had expected to see the usual tourist spectacle, but instead had witnessed something that reminded her why she had fallen in love with journalism in the first place. The genuine emotion between the American tourist and the young guard had been impossible to ignore. Margaret had watched Sarah's approach, listened to her gentle words, and observed the guard's subtle but meaningful response. As someone who had spent decades recognizing authentic human stories, she knew she had witnessed something special. That morning, Margaret called her former colleague, Richard Sterling, who now worked as a producer for a popular morning television show. "Richard, I have a story for you," she said without preamble. "Yesterday I witnessed the most beautiful display of human compassion at Buckingham Palace, and I think the world needs to hear about it." Richard listened as Margaret described the scene in vivid detail. As a seasoned media professional, he immediately recognized the story's potential to touch hearts and remind people of the power of kindness. "Do we know who either of them were?" Richard asked. "No names," Margaret replied. "But I have descriptions, and I'm sure we could find them if we approach this sensitively." The woman was clearly American, probably in her 60s, traveling alone. The guard was young, early 20s perhaps, and something about the interaction suggested he was going through a difficult time. Richard was intrigued. "Let me make some calls. If we can locate them and they're willing to share their story, this could be exactly the kind of positive news people need to hear right now." Meanwhile, Sarah was exploring the Tower of London when her phone rang. Her daughter Emma was calling with excitement in her voice. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," Emma said. "A friend of mine saw a post on social media about an American tourist who had a touching moment with a royal guard yesterday. The description sounds exactly like what you told us about." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "What kind of post?" "Someone posted a video clip on Instagram. You can't see faces clearly, but you can see a woman in a blue coat talking to a guard, and then there's this moment where they look at each other, and you can feel the emotion even through the screen. It's already got thousands of views and comments from people saying how moved they were." Sarah sat down on a nearby bench, overwhelmed by the news. She had never intended for their private moment to become public, and she worried about the potential consequences for the young guard. "Emma, I need you to help me figure out how to handle this," Sarah said. "I don't want that young man to get in trouble because of me." At the same time, James was having his own conversation with Michael Chen, who had just shown him the viral social media post. "Mate, I think this might be about you," Michael said, holding up his phone. "The timing matches your shift yesterday, and the description of the interaction sounds like what you mentioned." James watched the grainy video with a mixture of pride and concern. The moment had clearly touched many people, but he worried about the attention it might bring. "The comments are incredible," Michael continued, scrolling through the responses. "People are calling it the most beautiful thing they've seen all year. There are comments from veterans, from people who have lost loved ones, from parents thanking the tourist for showing kindness to someone's son." James felt overwhelmed by the response. "I hope this doesn't cause problems for either of us," he said quietly. "Thompson," Sergeant Major Williams called from across the courtyard. "A word, please." James's stomach dropped as he approached his superior officer, certain that the viral video had reached official attention and that consequences were coming. "Sir?" James began, but Williams held up a hand to stop him. "I've been fielding calls all morning," Williams said. "Apparently, you've become something of an internet sensation. The palace press office wants to discuss how to handle the situation." James felt the color drain from his face. "Am I in trouble, sir?" Williams studied him for a moment, then surprised James with a slight smile. On the contrary, Thompson, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. People are praising both you and the tourist for demonstrating the very values our institution represents: duty, compassion, and human dignity. At that moment, Williams' phone rang. "This is probably about you," he told James before answering. "Sergeant Major Williams speaking." James could only hear one side of the conversation, but he caught enough to understand that media outlets were requesting interviews, and that the palace was considering making a statement about the incident. After Williams ended the call, he turned back to James. That was BBC News. They want to do a feature story about yesterday's incident. They've apparently been in contact with the American tourist as well. James felt his pulse quicken. The woman? They found her? Her name is Sarah Mitchell from Ohio. According to the producer I just spoke with, she's concerned about you and wants to make sure her actions don't cause you any professional difficulties. The fact that this stranger was worried about his well-being, even after their story had gone viral, touched James deeply. Her concern for him confirmed what he had sensed during their brief interaction, that her kindness was genuine and selfless. "What happens now, sir?" James asked. "That depends on several factors," Williams replied. "The palace is generally supportive of positive stories that highlight the human side of our service. If both you and Mrs. Mitchell are comfortable with it, they're considering arranging a proper meeting between you two." James felt his heart race at the possibility of meeting Sarah again, this time without the barriers of protocol and duty between them. That afternoon, Sarah received a call from Richard Sterling at the BBC. "Mrs. Mitchell, my name is Richard Sterling, and I'm a producer with BBC Morning. We understand you had a remarkable encounter at Buckingham Palace yesterday." Sarah listened as Richard explained how the story had come to their attention and the positive response it was generating online. "I want to be very clear," Sarah said firmly. "I will not participate in anything that could harm that young man's career or reputation. He was doing his job with dignity, and I don't want my actions to cause him problems." "Actually, Mrs. Mitchell," Richard replied, "quite the opposite seems to be happening. The palace has been in touch with us, and they're viewing this as a positive representation of their values. We've been told that Guard Thompson, that's his name, James Thompson, is equally concerned about any consequences for you." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Even in the midst of unexpected fame, this young man was thinking about her welfare. "Would you be interested in meeting Guard Thompson in a more appropriate setting?" Richard asked. "We understand that both of you were moved by your brief encounter, and there might be value in allowing that connection to develop naturally." Sarah thought about her late husband and what he would have advised her to do. She thought about her children's encouragement to embrace new experiences during her trip to London. Most importantly, she thought about the young guard whose eyes had held such pain and hope. "If it would be helpful to him," she said finally, "and if it might encourage others to reach out with kindness to people who need it, then yes, I would be honored to meet him properly." 2 days later, Sarah found herself sitting in a quiet cafe near Westminster, nervously checking her watch every few minutes. The BBC had arranged for her to meet James Thompson in a neutral private setting, away from the public eye and media attention. She had spent the morning wondering what they would say to each other now that they could actually have a conversation. James arrived exactly on time, dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans and a navy sweater that made him look even younger than Sarah had initially thought. When he spotted her sitting by the window, his face lit up with the same recognition she had seen in his eyes at the palace. "Mrs. Mitchell?" He approached her table tentatively. "Please, call me Sarah," she said, standing to greet him. Without hesitation, she opened her arms and gave him the motherly hug she had wanted to offer him at Buckingham Palace. "And you must be James." James accepted the embrace gratefully, feeling a warmth and comfort he hadn't experienced since before his father's diagnosis. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." They sat down together, and for a moment, neither knew quite how to begin. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "How are you doing?" she asked with genuine concern. "I've been worried that our little moment might have caused trouble for you." James shook his head. "Actually, It's been quite the opposite. That day changed everything for me. I called my parents for the first time in weeks. I started talking to my colleagues about what I was going through, and I remembered that it's okay to let people see that I'm human. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I'm so glad. I could see in your eyes that you were carrying something heavy, and I just couldn't walk away without letting you know that someone cared. Tell me about your husband, James said gently. You mentioned losing him, and I could hear the love in your voice even in those brief words at the palace. Sarah smiled through her tears and began to tell James about her 40-year marriage to Robert, about his service in the army, about their 3 children, and about the difficult but meaningful journey of caring for him through his final illness. Grief was overwhelming at first, she admitted. I felt like I had lost my purpose along with my partner. That's actually why I came to London. My children encouraged me to do something just for me, to remember who I was beyond being a wife and mother. James listened intently, struck by the parallels between Sarah's experience and his own current struggles. How did you find your way through it? He asked. Honestly, by doing exactly what I did with you that day. I started looking for opportunities to help other people, to use my pain to recognize pain in others and offer comfort. It didn't take away my grief, but it gave it meaning. James nodded slowly. I think I understand. I've been so focused on hiding my struggles that I forgot they might actually help me connect with others who are going through similar things. Tell me about your father, Sarah said gently. James hesitated for a moment, then began to share the story of his father's cancer diagnosis, the fear his family was living with, and the pressure he had felt to remain strong for everyone, while dealing with his own terror about losing the most important man in his life. The hardest part, he admitted, is that I'm supposed to be this symbol of strength and stability. People look at the guards and see these unbreakable figures, but inside I'm just a scared young man who doesn't know how to help his father fight this disease. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. James, your father doesn't need you to be unbreakable. He needs you to be present, to be honest about your fears, and to love him through this. Your strength comes from your willingness to care so deeply, not from your ability to hide your emotions. They talked for over 2 hours, sharing stories about their families, their fears, their hopes, and their dreams. Sarah told James about her work as a school counselor and her passion for helping young people navigate difficult times. James told Sarah about his decision to join the Guards, his pride in serving his country, and his plans for the future. What do you want to do after your service? Sarah asked. I've been thinking about teaching, James replied. Working with young people who might be struggling the way I have been, maybe helping them understand that it's okay to ask for help and that vulnerability can actually be a strength. Sarah's face lit up. James, that's wonderful. You have so much to offer. Your sense of duty, your compassion, your understanding of what it means to carry responsibility at a young age. You could make such a difference in young people's lives. As their conversation continued, both Sarah and James began to realize that their chance encounter had evolved into a genuine friendship. Despite the difference in their ages and backgrounds, they had found common ground in their experiences of loss, their commitment to service, and their belief in the power of human kindness. I have something for you, Sarah said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out the folded note she had tried to leave for him at the palace. I wrote this before I approached you that day. I wasn't sure if I would have the courage to give it to you, but I want you to have it now. James unfolded the paper and read her words. You matter. Your service matters. Someone in Ohio is praying for you. Stay strong. A friend. I am praying for you, Sarah said, for you and your family. And I want you to know that you now have a friend in Ohio who cares about your well-being. James wiped away tears as he carefully folded the note and put it in his wallet. Thank you, Sarah. You have no idea how much this means to me, and you have a friend in London who will never forget your kindness. As their meeting came to an end, they exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. Sarah planned to visit James's father's treatment center to offer support and encouragement, and James promised to update her regularly on his father's progress and his own journey. Before we say goodbye, James said, I want you to know that meeting you has changed how I think about my service. You helped me understand that being strong doesn't mean being isolated, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is allow ourselves to be seen and comforted by others. Sarah hugged him one more time. And you helped me remember that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of a new kind of purpose, a new way of connecting with the world. As they parted ways outside the cafe, both Sarah and James felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected friendship that had grown from a moment of spontaneous compassion. Neither could have predicted that their brief encounter at Buckingham Palace would lead to such a meaningful connection, but both knew that their lives had been permanently changed for the better. The BBC feature about their story would air the following week, but the real impact of their meeting was already taking place. In the renewed hope James felt about his father's recovery, in the sense of purpose Sarah had rediscovered, and in the reminder they had both received about the transformative power of human kindness. 6 months later, Sarah received a phone call that would bring her the greatest joy she had felt since her husband's passing. James's voice was bright with excitement as he shared the news she had been hoping to hear. Sarah, I have wonderful news, he said, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. Dad's latest scan came back clear. The doctors are calling it a complete remission. Sarah dropped into her favorite armchair in her Ohio living room, tears of relief and happiness streaming down her face. Oh, James, that's incredible. How is he feeling? How are you feeling? He's like a new man, James replied. The strength is coming back, his appetite has returned, and yesterday he actually asked if he could come visit me at the barracks. And me? I feel like I can breathe again for the first time in almost a year. Their friendship had flourished over the month since their meeting in London. They exchanged regular emails, video calls, and letters. Sarah had sent care packages to James and his family during the most difficult phases of his father's treatment, while James had shared photos and stories from his daily life as a guardsman. There's something else, James continued. I've been accepted into a teacher training program. I start in September, just after my service with the Guards ends. I'm going to specialize in counseling and youth development. Sarah felt her heart swell with pride. James, that's wonderful. You're going to touch so many young lives. Your students will be lucky to have someone who understands struggle and resilience the way you do. I never would have had the courage to pursue this path without our friendship, James admitted. You taught me that our difficulties can become our greatest strengths if we're willing to share them with others. The BBC feature about their story had aired to an overwhelmingly positive response. Viewers from around the world had reached out to share their own stories of unexpected kindness and human connection. The segment had been viewed millions of times online and had inspired countless acts of compassion between strangers. Margaret Hopkins, the retired journalist who had first brought their story to media attention, had received hundreds of emails from people who had been moved to reach out to someone in need after watching the program. Veterans had written to thank Sarah for recognizing the human being behind the uniform. Parents had expressed gratitude for her reminder that their children serving in various capacities around the world were still someone's precious sons and daughters. Sarah had also experienced profound changes in her life. The sense of purpose she had rediscovered through her friendship with James had led her to volunteer at a local veterans center, where she provided counseling and support to military families dealing with deployment, injury, and loss. I have news too, Sarah told James during their call. I've been asked to speak at a conference for military family support groups. They want me to talk about the importance of civilian-military connections and how small acts of kindness can bridge the gap between service members and the communities they serve. That's perfect for you, James said warmly. You have such a gift for helping people understand that we're all connected, that service members aren't separate from the communities we protect. We're part of them. 3 weeks later, James was standing at his post at Buckingham Palace when he noticed a familiar figure in the crowd of tourists. Sarah had returned to London, this time accompanied by her 3 adult children who had wanted to meet the young man who had become such an important part of their mother's life. During his break, James was able to greet Sarah's family properly. Her daughter Emma hugged him tightly and whispered, "Thank you for helping our mom find herself again." Her sons David and Lisa echoed the sentiment, expressing their gratitude for the friendship that had brought their mother back to life. "We were worried about her after Dad died," David confided to James. "She seemed lost, like she didn't know who she was without him. But your friendship reminded her that she still had so much to give to the world." That evening, Sarah and her children joined James and his parents for dinner at a small restaurant near the Thames. James's father, now healthy and vibrant, embraced Sarah with tears in his eyes. "You saved my son," he told her simply. "During the darkest time of our family's life, you reminded him that he wasn't alone, that it was okay to be afraid, and that love could carry us through anything." Sarah looked around the table at this extended family that had grown from a moment of spontaneous compassion, and she felt Robert's presence with them. She knew her late husband would have loved James like another son, would have been proud of the bridges they had built between their different worlds. "James saved me too," Sarah replied. "He reminded me that our hardest experiences can become our greatest gifts if we're willing to share them with others. He showed me that healing happens not when we forget our pain, but when we use it to recognize and comfort pain in others." As the evening progressed, they shared stories, laughter, and dreams for the future. James spoke excitedly about his upcoming teaching career and his plans to develop programs that would help young people build resilience and empathy. Sarah talked about her growing involvement with veteran support organizations and her hope to establish a scholarship fund in her husband's name. The next morning, Sarah and her family returned to Buckingham Palace one final time before flying back to the United States. This time, when James was standing guard, the interaction was different. Sarah simply stood at the barrier with her children, and they all placed their hands over their hearts in a gesture of respect and love. James, maintaining his professional composure, gave the slightest nod, an acknowledgement that only they would recognize. But this time, the moment felt complete rather than fleeting. They had built something lasting from that first spontaneous connection. As Sarah's plane lifted off from Heathrow Airport, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had come to London as a grieving widow seeking distraction from her pain. She was returning home as a woman who had rediscovered her purpose, found a new family member, and learned that love multiplies when we share it freely. James, meanwhile, was preparing for the next chapter of his life with confidence and excitement he hadn't felt in years. His father's recovery, his upcoming transition to teaching, and his enduring friendship with Sarah had taught him that strength comes not from standing alone, but from having the courage to connect authentically with others. Their story had become more than just a viral moment or a heartwarming news feature. It had become a reminder that in a world that often feels divided and disconnected, the simple act of seeing and acknowledging another person's humanity can create ripples of healing that extend far beyond what we can imagine. Years later, James would tell his students about the day a stranger's kindness changed his life, and Sarah would share with the families she counseled about the young man who taught her that grief could be transformed into grace. Their brief encounter at Buckingham Palace had become a testament to the extraordinary power of ordinary human compassion, proving that sometimes the most profound connections begin with nothing more than one person choosing to reach out to another with an open heart.